Hello everybody and welcome back to another Hearthstone video. So today, Naxx was released. The Curse of Naxxramas finally is live and I cannot wait to get into it. But of course, as one might expect, the servers are down. I got home, I started to load it up, got ready to go into the game, and then all of a sudden I could not. So instead, rather than going through the first wing right away, I'm going to do a little video talking about all the different cards that have been released for Naxx that are not the class cards, because I've already done that one. Now that we know all the different cards that we have to work with, I'm going to go briefly over each one and just sort of talk a little bit about it, talk through it, see where we can get. And as soon as I can get into the actual game, I will record myself going through all of that, and we can enjoy that adventure together as well. So, let's get right into it. So, the way I've organized this is I've done it so that we do it by mana cost. So we'll start with the ones, we'll go all the way up to the only 8. So, let's talk about Zombie Chow. This is a 1-drop, it's a 2/3, so of course it is excellent value. And the death rattle is that you get, the enemy gets 5 health. You restore 5 health to your enemy hero. That's a really big downside. I actually think it's much worse than the Flame Imp, for instance, doing 3 damage to yourself. But interestingly enough, I think that especially if you can play it at the beginning of the game, this is a great tempo card and something that's very useful. It's going to lose a lot of value if you have to play it in the middle of the game. It's going to be a bit of a dead card, in fact, if you have to play it in the middle of the game. But if you get this on turn 1, even if it dies very quickly, you aren't going to give your opponent any health at all, or very little, because of course they won't have lost any. And more importantly, it's going to help you to establish really strong board presence right at the beginning of the game, which I think is probably the most important thing you can do early in the game, especially depending on what sort of a deck you have. So for that, I think that it's very good. A lot of other people have been pointing out as well that it is, you can actually use this if you have the Akanai Soul Priest to damage your opponent instead, which can be a neat combo, and I think that might be interesting. If you put this out in the middle of the game and then throw down an Akanai Soul Priest and suicide them into something, it could be a nasty surprise for your opponent if you're playing the Priest. I think that usage, everybody's saying that would be great for that, but of course I think that that's a very niche usage. I think more accurately this is really going to be a good early game tempo card, and used correctly, it will really put you ahead in the game. It's sort of like almost like a neutral Flame Imp in terms of value. Now this card was one of the first ones released, the Undertaker. Initially, I was dubious about it because I thought that it's a 1/2 for 1, which is fine, and it will slowly increase if you play other Death Rattle cards, but it's still pretty vulnerable. I think I've revised that to say that this actually has a pretty great chance of being effective, especially if you put it in a deck that it can be useful with. And so the interesting play that I suggested long ago, or that came to my mind long ago, was the idea that you would put down an Undertaker and then coin out a Leper Gnome if you were going to do a very aggressive deck. And then what you'd have is a 2/3 and a 2/1 on the board on turn 1, and I thought that was a very strong opening. And then you could have, either the Nerubian Egg, which we'll find shortly, either you could put down, a Loot Hoarder and then follow it up with a Harvest Golem. Like you can have neutral stuff that we already have, and just sort of slowly put down an excellent board tempo and keep growing this minion. I've revised that a little bit in my head to be that, in fact, you could play this at any point in the game, and it will basically always be useful if you have a very Death Rattle-centered deck. And so, actually, if you combine these two things, you can do some very neat stuff. For instance, on turn 3, you could play 2 Zombie Chows and an Undertaker, and what that would give you is the 2 2/3s and a 3/4, all on one turn on turn 3. That's actually terrifying, right? I mean, yes, there's potential to heal your opponent for 10 there, but the risk might outweigh the reward. So, I mean, the interesting thing about it is that being able to play it with just 1 mana says that essentially you can play it whenever you could fit it in. So if you're going to play 2 minions or more that have Death Rattle, it could be turn 8, and you still have an extra 3/4 sitting on the table, which I think is actually a very powerful thing at most points in the game. A 3/4 is a very good stat distribution. So I think that this will be used. I think that it's going to be popular, especially in the beginning when everybody does overloading the game with death rattle decks, which I don't doubt will happen. I think this will be very powerful, and it can fit in a lot of ways. The Nerubian Egg is going to be really good as well. I'm excited for the Nerubian Egg. It essentially is going to act as a very quick way of getting a 4/4 on the table. If you're playing something like a Warlock with a Void Caller, for instance, then you can have a 3/5 Void Caller and a 4/4 on the table very, very quickly. It's a turn 2, turn 3. If you can give it taunt somehow with a Sunfury Protector or, say, a Mark of the Wild, then you have either a 0/2 taunt or a 2/4 taunt, in the case of the Druid. And the opponent has to get through it, and it's a 4/4 at the end. So, I mean, there's a lot of really excellent combos you can use, especially for aggressive decks, early in the game with this thing. And the other thing about it is that it never really gets bad. Again, just like having a 3/4 on the table is usually useful, irrespective of when we're talking about in the game, having a 4/4 on the table is also pretty useful all the time. And no matter what, it's going to draw something. The opponent can't ignore this. And so you were talking about, they're going to have to blow a silence, or they're going to have to get rid of it in some way. And so spending that 2 mana is not just getting a creature that's sort of only a little bit useful on the table. It's threatening to be something very large, very scary, and it's forcing a reaction, especially in the early game. So I think it'll be a very well-used card, and I think that it will be quite popular. This card is amazing. The Echoing Ooze, when I saw this, I just smiled, and I couldn't stop smiling. It was great. The battle cry is summon an exact copy of this minion at the end of the turn. Exact copy means that it also includes buffs. Buffs and anything that you put on this thing will go to the new one. So for instance, if you're playing a Paladin and you put Blessing of Kings and Blessing of Wisdom on this thing, then you will have 2 5/6s on the table that can draw you a card whenever they attack by the end of your turn for half of the cost of what it should be. And so if you're playing a Druid, if you put Mark of the Wild on this, then by the end of the turn you will have 2 3/4 taunt minions on the table. That's fantastically powerful, especially because as a Druid, you can do that on turn 1. If you have the coin, if you go second, and you have Innervate, you can Innervate out the Echoing Ooze and coin the Mark of the Wild, or, well, do whatever. Coin the Ooze, Innervate the Mark of the Wild, whatever you'd like. But you can have 2 3/4 taunt minions on turn 1. That's incredible. So this is a really, really powerful card for decks that are buff-oriented, and I think that it will see a lot of play. Certainly in a number of decks that I am thinking of, I will be using this as much as humanly possible. Great combo card. The Haunted Creeper is another wonderful card. It's not as wonderful as some of the others, but I think that it will be very helpful for early aggressive decks. It's a 1/2 for 2, and so that's not especially interesting value-wise. But when it dies, it will summon 2 1/1 spiders in its place. And so it gives you continual board presence in the early game. I can see this being used in an early game Paladin deck. I can see this being used in a Zoo deck of some kind. I could see this being used in a number of different ways. Whenever you're looking for board control in the early game, I think this could be useful. And in decks that you can buff things with, so something like a Power of the Wild, for instance, just comes to my mind right away. I'm in Druid mode at the moment. You can see how this could be useful as a tempo device. The Narrowbar Weblord is going to be a really excellent thing to have in decks that are built for it. And so what that is to say is, if you have a deck that doesn't use a whole lot of battle cries, this will be a very good value card. It passes the vanilla test with flying colors, actually. It's 5 stat points for 2 mana, so that's great. Not the best of distributions, it's a 1/4. But essentially this is going to function like a mana wraith. This is going to be we're functionally going to delay the play of a bunch of cards, and it's going to be a little bit difficult to get rid of it. And so I think that that's useful, but by the same token, I think just like the Mana Wraith, the amount of times you will see it used is going to be pretty limited, just because it is very much a niche sort of a thing. Battle Cries are some of the most valuable spell effects in the game, and so I think that to make a deck consciously without using Battle Cries is a tough enterprise, and I think that it removes a lot of value to do. And so even if you have a game plan, you do have battle cries, and you have game plan by which to sort of do other stuff in the meantime. I think that it will not see a lot of play in the grand scheme of things. It will screw up your opponent something pretty hard, though, just because probably for at least a while people won't be expecting this, and it will throw a lot of plans off. So I think this is going to be, it's probably going to see a good amount of play early. I don't think it's going to see a lot of play in the long run. The Mad Scientist is a card that will basically only see play in, of course, Mage, Hunter, and Paladin decks. And the death rattle is that it will put a secret from your deck into the battlefield. This is obviously much more valuable for mages and to a lesser extent hunters than for paladins because of the secret cost. And so for mages, you're saving 3 mana when this happens, and for paladins, you're saving only 1. So it's not a bad card. It's 2/2 for 2, so it's theoretically fine. And I could see this being used for mage decks that are focused on secrets. I think that it will not be used very much in paladin decks, and I think that it will probably not be used very much in hunter decks either, particularly because for hunters, secret placement, secret timing is important, and putting out sort of arbitrary secrets might not be the best of things. For mages and other and paladins too, to an extent, it's not as bad. You don't have to plan for it quite as hard. But for hunters, it actually, well, I mean, for any class, to be fair, but I think for hunters especially, there is a certain degree of planning that you need to actually effectively use your secrets, and having a random one put into the field might or might not be as helpful. So we'll see. I predict that this will not see a ton of play, but I can see that it could be used in some niche decks. The Unstable Ghoul is basically Abomination Light. It's going to be a very useful anti-aggro card. A lot of people when the Paladin class card got released, a lot of people whined and they were very upset because they perceived that the Paladin really needed some sort of early game way to deal with aggressive decks. Because if you are a control Paladin and you're up against the Zoo, you have nothing to do before turn 4. You are very, very limited, and you might have already lost by then. The Unstable Ghoul is a really interesting addition to that. It's a taunt minion that will A, potentially hurt things anyway, it gets a 1/3, and B, it functions as a way to do a lot of damage to the field. This will shine in control decks as an anti-aggressive matter, or rather an anti-aggressive card. However, I think that on the grand scheme of things, the Wild Pyromancer is still going to be more useful than this. And the reason I say that is because you actually have control over when the Wild Pyromancer activates. You only may have control over where the Unstable Ghoul activates, just because you're relying on the opponent not to kill it, or you're relying on a situation being there that you will have to kill it yourself. The Wild Pyro, you can actually do a lot of stuff with. You can, in a control deck or decks that use Wild Pyros, you probably have a lot of spells, so you can trigger that 1 damage whenever you'd like, and you can trigger it twice. So, of the two, the Wild Pyro has better stats and is more, it's more reliable, it's more customizable that way. I still think, though, that the Unstable Ghoul will see some anti-aggro play, and I think that it will be helpful early on. Potentially for things like Paladins who want an easy 2-drop that's not a Wild Pyro, or sort of more control decks like that. The Deathlord is a very interesting card. It doesn't just beat the vanilla test. It actually blows it out of the water. It curb stomps the vanilla test. I mean, it's amazing. 10 stats for 3 mana is insane. The downside, though, is that you give the opponent a minion. You give them a minion on the battlefield, which is a really big tempo loss. But the exchange for that is that you get a 2/8 taunt minion, potentially extremely early in the game. That's really very powerful. And so I actually think that this will absolutely see a lot of play, and especially in decks like Watcher Druids and Watcher-focused decks in general, where silence is around. I think that you will see this card even more because you can see it silenced. I think that even though, the taunt is a very big part of this card's value, and, the 2/8 is obviously catered toward taunting, but I think even having a 2/8 on the board, even if it isn't taunted, if you've silenced it, is a very powerful thing, and I think a lot of people will be interested in that. So this will absolutely see play. I think it will be a popular card, and I think that it will see, I think it'll be in a lot of decks. I don't think that the Shade of Naxxramas will be in a lot of decks. I think that this is a card that people were really excited about initially, and I don't actually think is especially good. It's functionally a 3-3, because you put it down as a 2-2, and by the time you can use it, it's a 3-3. And whenever you want to use it thereafter, it can get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. I think that it's not going to see a whole lot of use, just because it is a bit of a tempo loss if you play it on turn 3. Your opponent could have played something like an Earthen Ring Farseer or some other 3-3 that actually has an impact right away, but a lot of players are going to feel like in order to get value out of their Shade, they're going to have it sit there in stealth mode and just sort of coalesce, sit there and gain and become more and more difficult to deal with. And so to a point, that's fine. But if you have this magical thing just sitting there, it's also not affecting the board at all, so it's not actually very useful. So we'll see how it works. I think that it could be used if a deck was built to cater to it. I think that it could be used effectively. And it is absolutely a dangerous card. I mean, it's difficult to remove anything in stealth, obviously. And as it gets bigger and bigger, it becomes obviously more and more difficult to get rid of it. But I think that it's not going to be quite as scary as some people might think, just because for the 3 slot, there may actually be a lot of things that are more easier and more useful to do. So the Stone Skin Gargoyle, really, really interesting. It's not a very useful card in stats alone. It does not pass the vanilla test. It's essentially a Dalaran mage. So it's not especially useful. But it heals itself every single turn. And so what's interesting about this is the combo capabilities. If I'm thinking about a druid and I'm thinking about Mark of the Wild, it suddenly becomes a much better Fen Creeper. For the same mana and 2 cards, it now becomes a 3-6 that heals itself every single turn. 3-6 with Taunt. And so that's useful. On its own, though, it doesn't have Taunt, and it isn't really capable of causing a lot of damage. And so that 1-4 is not going to be anything more than really just sort of an annoying thing. It actually sort of reminds me of a mage hero power with a health limit. Just because it can sort of do a damage at various things, but it doesn't have as much of an impact. So if you combo it, if you put another card into it, it can actually turn into something that would be a big problem very quickly. I think on its own, though, it's not going to see a lot of use. This is going to be in combo decks. Certainly I can see using it in a druid deck. I can see using it in any deck that has a lot of buffs associated with it. Priests, especially, as well. I could see priests pulling this with the Inner Fire combo. So, yeah, this is interesting. I think that it won't see a ton of play, and if it does, it will be in sort of gimmicky fashions. The Dancing Swords we've dealt with before. It's nice and simple, straightforward. It is a 4/4 for 3, so it's great value, except that your opponent gets a card when it dies. So this is going to see a lot of play for tempo. It's going to see a lot of very rapid start decks, right? So any deck that's concerned about sort of snowballing into a lead and snowballing into a win, this will be prime target for that. It's a really, really strong card. It'll also be very strong in decks that have good means of silencing themselves. So if you can play this and get away with silencing it the next turn, for instance, it's a really strong card. Very, very strong, no downside. So I think that in tempo decks it will see a lot of play, and I think in other decks it will probably not. There are other cards that are not quite as valuable at the 3 mana level, but certainly valuable enough without a downside. So I think that's powerful. Now, the one card that might be the most useful to combo with this, as a 3 sliding into a 4, is the Wailing Soul. The battle cry is to silence your other minions. At first, it doesn't look very good, right? It's a 3/5 for 4, so it passes the test. But by the same token, you don't want to silence your other stuff, right? Well, it turns out that when you combo it with, a lot of the cards here have, in Naxx, have a lot of downsides, right? For instance, if we go back to this guy, not that guy, this guy, he has a lot of downsides. You don't want to give your opponents a minion. That's terrible. But if you play that card on the following turn, now you've silenced it, and you still have a cheap and really high value card on the table. So when it comes to negative death rattles, this card is going to be excellent for cancelling them out and just letting you have the really high value stuff. I could see this being used in Warlock decks, the Demons, for instance. that sort of have a bad effect, although a lot of those are battle cries, so this isn't going to help that. And I could also see this being used in death rattle decks with the sole purpose of being sort of high value with a lot of downside. The sort of high risk, high reward style decks that I'm sure will come out after this. They'll be very aggressive tempo oriented decks. I think that the Wailing Soul will actually be very, very useful for them. So I think this will be quite powerful and will be used in niche decks. Certainly not in every deck, and certainly not all the time. We've talked a lot about the Baron in the past, or I think everybody has. This was one of the first cards released, so we've all had time to mull this one over. Your minions trigger the death rattles twice, which is great. Harvest golems suddenly spawn 2 broken golems, or damaged golems upon death. Cairn spits out 2 banes. The spider, the 2-mana little spider that spits out 2 1/1 spiders, now spits out 4. So there's a lot of cool stuff that can happen with Baron Rivendare. The big downsides that I think people have overlooked with him is that if you have a priest with Cabal, Shadow Priest, or a Mind Games, or well, not Mind Games, but Shadow Madness rather, anything that they can use to mind control, and even Shadow Word Pain. This card with 1 attack is not going to do a lot for the board, and it's also going to be quite vulnerable to being killed by some of those gimmicky things, or some of the sort of supposedly limited removal spells. Even a Stampeding Kodo, things like this that are supposed to not be as attractive because they can only get rid of certain cards. This actually falls into all those categories because of its attack. So it's powerful. It will be difficult to remove if you don't have a type of convenient removal, but priests in particular will be it'll be very easy for them to remove this. And a lot of people with things like the Stampeding Kodo and other such removals, it'll be okay to get rid of this guy. So it's not going to be that big of a deal. I think that with all the other really cool cards that are being added in Naxx, people will, it'll see play. I think people will absolutely use the Baron, and especially with super Death Rattle style decks that really get into that. But I actually don't think it's going to see as much use as some of the other big cards in Naxx, just because other ones have a lot more immediate impact and are much more immediately interesting, particularly with the stat allocations. So this is a good card. I think a lot of people will use it, but I don't think it's going to be overplayed. This card I think will be overplayed. The Spectral Knight is a 5-mana 4/6, so it passes the test, and it is a fairy dragon on steroids. It just can't be targeted by spells or hero powers. You have to cut through those 6 health on your own with no help. That's got to be minions, or area of effect spells, that sort of thing. This is a very, very difficult card to get rid of. And so I think that this will see a lot of play. I know a lot of classes have a hard time with 5-drops. A lot of classes don't have good 5-drops, and the neutral 5-drops currently in the game aren't the best. Although Naxx is adding a bunch of really good ones, and this is certainly one of them. I think that this card will see a lot of play. I think that people will love this card. It will help to shut down a lot of very spell-focused decks, and for that I think it will be very valuable. The Sludge Belcher is cool. It is Ascension Shieldmaster smashed together with a Goldshire Footman for the exact same price. So you have 5 mana, 3/5, and when it dies, it summons a 1/2 taunt slime as well. And so I think that's a really interesting thing. I think it's an efficient card. It basically puts 2 cards together, 2 taunt cards together. Although the Goldshire Footman is sort of usually not thought of as the best thing in the world. One of the worst things the Goldshire Footman has going for it is the fact that it actually requires a card on its own, because it's 1 mana, and in 1 mana slot there are a lot of more interesting things you can be doing. So if you can get the Goldshire Footman out without having to use the card, all the better. I think that actually is a very interesting thing. This sort of makes it so that you can't get rid of the taunt easily. Even if the second taunt is trivial, you still have to actually hit it with something. And so I think that this is actually quite a valuable card, and I think that certainly, I think the Fen Creeper after this expansion is going to be no longer used for any reason, because now we just have simply better options in the 5 mana taunt slot, and this is one of them. And so for 5 mana, for a mid-game taunt, I think this is pretty good. And I think that it will see a good deal of use as well. Lotheb. Excellent, excellent card, I think, and it will be the answer that a lot of us are looking for to things like the Miracle Rogue. for instance. Lotheb is a 5/5 for 5, which is great, and enemy spells cost 5 more mana the next turn. That's incredible. So, the Leroy combo that everybody absolutely loves, I know, for the Miracle Rogue. Leroy, Shadow Step, Leroy, Shadow Step, Leroy. Can't do that anymore, because Shadow Step now costs 5 mana. And so you can do that, can you even do that once? You can't even do that once. So, in actual fact, the Leroy combo is dead if you put Lotheb out for exactly and only that turn. So, that's very useful. It's very, very useful. In general, against spell-focused decks, this will ruin a Mage's Day who's aiming to do a Pyroblast. It will ruin a Mage's Day who's aiming to double Fireball you. It will ruin a Shaman's Day who wants to control your board with, either Feral Wolves, the Storm, or even things like a Lava Burst. I think that this will be a very good card to play against control decks. This is very clearly anti-control, and I think it's a very powerful late-game card. So I think that, especially in the current meta, well, frankly, the current meta is going to go to hell. I think everybody's going to be doing a lot of different stuff. But if Miracle Rogue continues to be a problem for some reason, I think that this card will be teched in very, very often, and I think it will shut down Miracle Rogue quite hard. Stellag and Fugan, we can actually just consider them part of the same unit, and I will. Essentially, if they both die, you get an 11/11. A giant 11/11. That's incredible. And in their own right, they are excellent cards. They both have 11 stats on them for 5 mana, which is great. One is a 7/4, which is not a great stat distribution, and the other one is a 4/7, which is actually very good. It's very strong. And so I think that a lot of people will use Fugan and prefer him over Stellag, but I think that a lot of decks that will put them in will put them both in, of course. Now, notable, if you silence one of them, if you silence the death rattle of the second one, Thaddeus probably will not be... Thaddeus won't be summoned, because it's a death rattle effect. So, you can prevent the hammer from coming down, as it were. But in any case, I think that this is sort of a niche combo that isn't going to get a lot of play. I don't think Thaddeus is going to be called out very often. But the individual minions are valuable enough on their own. They do pass the vanilla test quite well, and they do so in the 5 slot, which is sort of rare. They pass it enough on their own that I think people will especially be using Fugan, and if they're going to use Fugan, they probably will also throw Stalag in there as well. So, I think this is going to see moderate use, particularly in sort of, I could see this in tempo decks very easily. I could see this in a tempo deck. And even in some control decks that are interested in the late game, I could see this being sort of an early to late control sort of a card. Especially if you were to buff this, the 4/7 is a very good stat distribution for something like... I keep on going back to the Mark of the Wild Druid, but it is near and dear to my heart. It will become a 6/9, which is incredible with Taunt. That's a very hard thing to get rid of, and it's a very powerful card. So I think that Stalag and Fugan will see use, absolutely. Our penultimate card here is Mexna. This is the one we're going to get this week, and will be all over the ladder tomorrow. I can feel it. This is essentially a giant Emperor Cobra. It is a 2/8 for 6, which is a bad deal. But the good deal is, if it touches anything, it dies. And it has 8 health, which means that it will very likely not die easily. It's probably going to take 2 to 3 cards to get rid of this. And so almost always, it's probably going to be a good deal. And I think this is a very powerful card. I think this will be going in a lot of decks. I mean, I say that a lot. I've said that a lot this video. I think that a lot of cards in Naxx are really powerful looking. And I think, as a result, a lot of cards are going to be put in a lot of decks. And it's going to take some experimenting on the part of the community to see what is really valuable and what really will stay for the long durée. Whether or not Mexna will, that's a good question, especially because she's very vulnerable to things like the Cabal Shadow Priest. I still don't know how to pronounce that. I've heard it both ways. And Shadow Madness. Shadow Madness would ruin your day if you had Mexna on the table. And there are just a lot of ways to deal with a 2/8 when it comes to doing something with the attack. So I think that Mexna will probably see, well, it will obviously see a lot of use in the next week because it's fresh and interesting, but I think that in the long run it may not see a lot of use, just because, like the Emperor Cobra, it's a little bit temperamental, and even though it can answer something, it can kill basically whatever that's problematic, it also has some downsides too, and you certainly, especially if you're playing against a priest that now has a lot of different ways of dealing with this, you don't want this thing turned around on you. So I think that it will see a lot of use, I think that it's valuable, but by the same token I think it might not be as valuable and as useful as a lot of the other stuff that's out there. Finally, the biggest card in Naxx, the big guy, well, except Thaddeus, but that's not really a card. Kelthuzad is the big finisher, the big legendary of Naxx. It is a 6/8 for 8, and at the end of each turn, summon all friendly minions that died this turn. That's incredible. For that amount of mana and that sort of position in the game, it can really turn it around. You have to kill Kelthuzad before you kill anything else on the board, or else you may not have killed those things in the first place. You may as well not have. So this is very powerful for that. Now, the one thing for me, it looks very powerful, looks crazy, but I don't know whether or not it's going to see a lot of play. I actually don't think it will, because the people who are going to use this is going to really be, it'll probably be more control decks, right? It's the same reason why King Crush doesn't get used very often in Hunter decks. The pace is way off. In sort of high-tempo decks, playing an 8-mana creature really sucks up your turn. And so, you know, I think that generally speaking, it's not going to get a ton of play with tempo decks. There's better things you can do at 8 mana. But I could be wrong about that. I think that it might see some play. It is very, very powerful. But for control decks, I would have a hard time justifying this over something like Rag. Control decks have very few minions in them, and so the idea that you would continue to keep all of the minions that you have and make this guy the priority, for 8 mana you could probably have a more immediate impact on the board, like for instance Rag, or even Ysera, although that's 9 mana. So I think it's good, I think it's powerful, I think if it comes on the field, your opponent will be absolutely forced to drop cards and kill it, but I don't think that it will see a ton of use. I think that it will actually probably drop to the sort of second tier of 8-mana legendaries, is my guess. Just because it doesn't have the immediate board impact that something like a Rag does. In any case, so that's all of the cards for Naxx. I've now gone over all of them with this video and my previous one, the preview for all of the class cards. I don't know how any of this is really going to go. I'm not sure what decks are going to come out of it. I certainly have 3 or 4 ideas that I will be trying as soon as the cards are available for them. I'm really excited about how this is going to change up the meta. You can expect in the next little while several more videos from me. I will be covering all of the Naxx content very closely. And certainly when it comes to deck building, I love deck building, as you know, and deck building and theory crafting is sort of my thing. And so I will certainly be demonstrating, especially once Naxx is done and all the cards are out, but even before, I will certainly be demonstrating a lot of different Naxx-centered decks, and regular old decks that can benefit from some Naxx cards. Certainly my Ramp Druid and some other things of that nature can certainly have a bit of an update with all these new cards coming out. I'm really excited to play with some of the new stuff. So in any case, guys, thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions or want to comment, please do. And I'll read everything. I always do, and I'll get back to you. And in any case, I will keep doing all this Naxx stuff. Stay tuned for more Naxx content, and I will see you guys next time.